Today I'm going to be speaking about some research that we're doing in our lab about a concept called decentering, and I'll explain what that is a little bit more. So we've heard a lot today about the importance of emotions and emotion regulation. We all know that emotion regulation is important. The capacity to flexibly regulate emotions, to bring behavior in line with our goals, values, is critical to mental health and well-being. In problems with emotion regulation, as Dave and Marcel pointed out already, are characteristic of many disorders, many psychological disorders. So in our lab, we've been interested in this process, in this emotion regulation process called decentering, which is essentially a process of adopting a detached but accepting or non-judgmental perspective on internal experiences, things like thoughts and emotions. So in essence, you're becoming a detached observer of your own experience, of your own mind. And this capacity is cultivated by mindfulness meditation practice, and probably by meditation practice more generally. So there are two self-report measures of decentering, or the capacity to adopt this perspective. So these measures have attempted to describe this process, what is it, and also measure how good people are at engaging in this process. And studies that have used these self-report measures of decentering have shown that the capacity to decenter can be enhanced by cognitive and mindfulness-based interventions for different kinds of disorders, particularly for major depressive disorder. In treatment-related gains in decentering capacity, that is, improvements in the ability to decenter, have been associated with all kinds of benefits. Things like increased self-compassion, reduced behavioral avoidance, so avoiding things that make you scared, reduced depression and anxiety symptoms, increased positive affect, positive emotions, and reduced depressive relapse rates. That means if you've had a depressive episode in the past, are you going to have one again in the future? So we know a lot about the mood benefits of decentering, that this is a healthy process. But it's still not relatively well defined as a concept, as what we call a construct. We think it's a multifaceted, or has many aspects to this process. We refer to processes like psychological distancing, the capacity to kind of take a step back from your experience, also acceptance of your experience, and non-judgment. So we don't really know what are the active ingredients of decentering in terms of which aspects of this process result in what we call salutary benefits or mood benefits. We also don't know whether this process is more or less conscious. That is, whether it is an intentional process that you have to think about, or one that occurs relatively automatically and unconsciously. So in other words, decentering is kind of a puzzle, and scientists love puzzles. So in my research, I'm starting to zoom in on this process of zooming out. And focusing on this process of really stepping back from our experiences, and distressing experiences in particular. And how does taking a step back and looking at your experience from a distance change your emotional experience? So in the current study, we developed what we call an implicit psychological distancing task. So unbeknownst to participants, we manipulated psychological distance from distressing stimuli, visual stimuli, so external stimuli. And participants were not aware that we were manipulating the distance. And we examined whether this manipulation was associated with salutary effects, that is, reduced emotional reactivity to the negative stimuli. Secondly, we examined whether the capacity, or whether individual differences in self-reported mindfulness and self-reported decentering as measured by, self-report, and whether those two self-report measures predicted performance on our task, so whether or not participants benefited from increasing psychological distance on this task. So here's the design of our experiment. I'll explain a little bit about it. So we had, the stimuli for the task were 144 images of objects. And these objects were previously rated or standardized for their negative and neutral emotional valence. So negative objects were things like spiders and sharp objects, things that are considered threatening or dangerous mostly. Some of the stimuli had sad or other kinds of negative emotional content. And then we had neutral images that were things like batteries or a hairbrush, things that are not typically thought to be distressing or cause any kind of emotional reaction. So here's the design of the experiment, and just bear with me if this is confusing. Participants saw 4 blocks of images of objects. So in these blocks, they saw images one at a time. 2 of the blocks of objects were negative in valence, and 2 of them were neutral. So before each block of images, participants got 1 of 2 instructions to follow for all the images in the block. So in the first instruction condition, they were told, for all the images that you see, we want you to decide whether the object would fit into the palm of your hand or not. Would the size fit into the palm of your hand? In the second condition, we told them, we want you to imagine, or we want you to decide whether each of the objects that you see would fit into a standard shoebox or not. And so they were to say, yes, it would fit, no, it would not fit, or I'm not sure. And so we expected that emotional reactivity would be greatest following the condition, the negative hand condition, when participants are imagining these negative objects like spiders and sharp objects actually in the palm of their own hand, close to their bodies, versus the shoebox condition when they're imagining the objects at a greater distance from their bodies, kind of encapsulated in a shoebox. And so we had a couple of dependent measures, and you guys are probably familiar with this terminology from the workshop. But dependent measures are outcome measures. So how do we know whether our manipulation worked? Our 2 dependent measures were self-reported negative affect and reaction time. Specifically, after participants saw each block of images, they rated the degree to which they felt a series of negative emotion words. Things like afraid, distressed. And we averaged those ratings to come up with an index of negative affect for each block. We also calculated the average reaction time for each image in each block. So this was served as an additional indicator of emotional reactivity. So specifically, blocks that had longer reaction times, where participants were taking longer to respond to the images, were thought to have greater emotional reactivity. So there's more the emotions are interfering more with their ability to accomplish the task. So the degree to which our participants experienced reduced distress in the shoebox condition versus the hand condition, so that is when the objects are further away in space versus closer to their bodies, was an indication to us of their distancing capacity. That is, how much did they benefit from this manipulation? So I'll spare you the calculations here, but just know that negative scores, that is, negative scores on this task were better, were indicative of better distancing capacity. And neutral or positive scores were indicated less distancing capacity, less good performance. So we correlated, that is, we looked at the association between performance on this task and self-reported individual differences in self-reported mindfulness and decentering. These are just some characteristics of the population of participants that we used for this study. So these were mostly college students. We had a sample of about 91 subjects. The mean age was about 20 years old. They were mostly English-speaking students. And approximately a little bit more than half were female. And approximately 7% of our sample reported a history of diagnosis or treatment for depression symptoms. And the same amount, approximately 7%, reported a history of diagnosis or treatment for an anxiety disorder. So we think that our population was relatively representative of the student population at Kent State University, where we are. So these graphs might be a little bit confusing, but all they show really is that across the whole sample, when we look at all of our participants, we saw the expected effect of negative affect. So participants rated the negative, they experienced more negative affect when the objects were negative versus when the objects were neutral, just as we expected. And in terms of reaction time, they took longer to respond to the negative images than the neutral images. So that was also as we expected. What we did not see is an effect of distance. So emotional reactivity did not vary as a function of how far the objects were perceived, whether they were perceived in the hand or farther away from the body in a shoebox. So that was across the whole sample. But then we looked at individual differences in mindfulness and decentering to see, well, maybe it's that people who are better at mindfulness or have greater mindfulness capacity do better on this task, show more benefits of the distancing manipulation. And that's exactly what we see. So there's a correlation between mindfulness and performance on the task. So if you're more mindful, you experience a greater drop, a greater benefit from increasing psychological distance than if you have a low mindfulness, if you're not very mindful. But we didn't see the expected relationship with the decentering self-report measure. So that was not expected. Interestingly, we see that two aspects of mindfulness, acting with awareness and non-judgment of experience, were associated with better effects of distancing. So people who are better, who act with awareness and who are better at not judging their experience, experienced greater benefit in terms of reduced emotional reactivity on our task. This figure just shows that in terms of reaction time, individuals that had, or participants who had high decentering demonstrated a benefit on the task, so they experienced reduced emotional reactivity as a function of the distance. But people that had low decentering, if you weren't very good at decentering according to your self-report measure, if you had high awareness, you did better on the task. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing. But if you were good at decentering, you got a benefit from the task, and if you were not good at decentering, if you were more aware, you still did better on the task than if you had low awareness. So low awareness and low decentering was the worst combination. Okay, so our results suggest that increasing psychological distance in this implicit task had salutary effects or benefits, emotional benefits, but not all individuals benefited equally from increasing psychological distance. The benefits were unique to individuals who reported more mindful awareness and non-judgment. And in one case, in terms of reaction time, individuals that reported higher levels of decentering. So we have a few next steps in terms of this research. Students of the workshop will know that self-report measures of emotion are not particularly good. People have a hard time describing how they're feeling often. And so these aren't the best measures of emotion. It's sometimes better to use more direct measures like looking at blood pressure as a way of assessing arousal, and other kinds of more direct, what we call psychophysiological measures. These can be like neuroimaging or functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we're planning to continue this research using those more direct measures of emotional arousal to see how emotions change as a result of our distancing task. We also want to look at the relationship of task performance to meditation experience, because right now all we used was a self-report measure of mindfulness. We didn't look at people who deliberately practice mindfulness meditation. We also want to know more about the mechanisms of the salutary effects or the benefits of psychological distancing. So what I mean is, why exactly does this have an emotion regulation effect when we move something farther away from us? Why is that beneficial? Is it because we are getting further away from the source of the threat? Is it because it's increasing the likelihood that we think about the threat in a different way? Or is it something related to reducing the tendency to process information in a self-referential way? So reducing the self-centered nature of processing in our minds. And we also have plans to look at this, the neural mechanisms, the brain mechanisms of this psychological distancing. One last comment. So you will probably notice that this task, what we are typically interested in this task is, or in looking at decentering, is the ability to distance from internal experiences, thoughts and emotions, things of that nature. But in this task, we're looking at the ability to distance from physical stimuli, things outside of oneself. So that's an area of discrepancy. And one of the questions that I have for you is, do you think that these are two sides of the same coin? Essentially, if you are better able to distance from external stimuli, does that also mean you're better able to distance from internal stimuli? Thank you.
진득이 샤바 나지 제간도네 네 마용네 네 라니 상유는 대바 차네 네 세네 포고요 레상도 진득 인자 다 베베 카벨 샤바는 생상연 담르상 생상베 바나나 따주스 네 되응ombo 라틸라 네 소메테세 상노라 바나갈 따주 따야는데 요르데 용에 요마로 테나지기다 세네 소야 그 상노다 용주명이 몸보 여자 디기 세네 소바 레상도 다 세네 나딩이지라 양자 코 가르이나야 상도 주바이나 양코 딕토로 냄베게 손으로 지네 양코 용주명이 몸이 싸우는 그 신이 둘러야 그네 인가다고 요 말에 생만 드리지순스
if I heard it properly, in your presentation you said that in your kind of trainings, the participants are led to think about their thoughts. And when we talk about thoughts, they may have so many different things coming up into their mind. And my caution is that when we try to think about the thoughts that is coming into our mind, in our tradition we will say that there's a saying that you can have a horse race in the space in terms of thought, but in practical you are not able to bite your own palm. This is palm, right? Yeah. And that means there's a big difference between the practical things that you can do and things that pop up into your thoughts. So that's why we try not to go after the thoughts. So if you are asking the people to go after the thoughts and think about the thoughts, we think that you are aggravating the problems that they have with their thoughts. So what would you say?
Okay, yeah, so it's not that we are asking them to go after the thoughts. In fact, we think that there's a tendency for the mind to just go and go and go, and oftentimes we don't even recognize the thoughts that are on our mind, and when we don't recognize them, they have a greater capacity to affect our emotions. So think about, if I have the thought, I'm a failure, and I just let it go without recognizing that I'm having a thought, it's going to really affect my emotions. Does that make sense? But if I think about it differently, and I say, I'm having the thought that I'm a failure, it's going to affect me less. I'm going to recognize it as just a thought I'm having. So in a way, it enables us to let the thoughts go more than if we didn't recognize them or if we weren't aware of them.
Similarly, Yanta Janton says, Similarly, Yanta Janton said, Simtur Tanzinja said, Chichiro, Ani Yan Karsena, Simla Karat and the Tangigur says, Gora, Utazugala Ping, I and Gandru Tonsora, Karsena. Similarly, Yanta Janton, Ani Simsula Tanzinjiala, Ani Simla Karating Lutilatani, any Simla Duating at the Kayati Timaravera. Karatemba Tangigaina. Se karate de tenji gor la sonata teach gaina semla tanzin chia ta semsuli yang thorant ta te yong mar samudu pisana karila ina ta sosula pe dubu ching ga dan ro ji baina ta tela khunjin ro ji ta ngi tela pe khunlin chi logo ta to chi go khunga la dubu chi dungi khu se go sama ro ji temba ina ta te sosu te ten goya ta te yang sa te ni de baina shi chiri chiri no ni nyota cha yong ro tini sonza te Tini temba ina ti tenji gore kararse ta ngaru chi nimba ina semsur tanzin la disana tini tengi o mar ta ku tini chiwa ina khoyang chi yang ku ko thu ta mombu chi ka chiwa ra samni khola zopa go ma ta tini thapsi chiwa ina ani semsur tanzin chi ni semngeli ya tarant ro ni phengro wa tini sonsa tini parola ngend ro chu thong du te karena.
I think you talk about emotional regulations, and also you talk about the awareness of your thoughts. So if you are talking about the importance of both of these kind of mental processes, from where I have understood is that these two things are kind of contradictory to each other. Because if you are regulating your emotion means you are controlling your emotions. You are trying to regulate them. And if you are when you talk about awareness of your thoughts, and if you are letting your thoughts come and try to recognize them, that means you are inviting the thoughts and you are not regulating the thoughts. So these two are quite kind of two different processes. And so are you saying that these are two separate kind of training exercises, or they are kind of similar in nature? Is it a same kind of training?
Yeah, very, very good question. We often think about two different kinds of emotion regulation. One type is very effortful and requires a lot of thinking. Something like reappraisal, where let's say you are looking at a picture of a person who is standing on the edge of a cliff. One way of thinking about that picture is that the person is going to jump off the cliff. And another way of thinking about it is that the person has just decided not to jump off the cliff. And thinking about that picture in two different ways will have very different emotional consequences. One is relief, and the other is sadness. So that's one way of kind of regulating one's emotions. Another way, which we think is more kind of automatic maybe, is just and is more kind of acceptance-based and more inviting the thoughts in, is this decentering, where you step back, but you're not stepping back to get away, you're stepping back to engage more with the object of your mind, to understand it better. What is this thought? Where is it coming from? How is it related to my larger experience?
And I inferred from Geshe-la's comment that maybe emotion regulation is a static state of mind, but it's actually a dynamic process. Emotions do not stand still, the mind does not stand still, and effective emotion regulation is responding to whatever is arising in the mind so that you are maintaining optimal performance, optimal behavior. Perhaps the aspiration, the objective, the ultimate is a perfectly quiet state of mind. But for most of us who aren't contemplatives, we have to settle for a state of mind where we are at least attending to the products in our mind, responding to them, but not becoming burdened by them.
ane paran drama da tun chene ane mege ane karno ta ane kanza den su gi nanju manda kande thon yume gi ton la shin su so odi kas ane par yaga ji tam ta pa ning je wado ji tam bina kanza den sla khud nanju chi ga yong mun dos ane de muyong bdi ane chen gar chebe de ta ngi chodi kandes ane yijin khurang 무니 안에 젠신의 슈진 딜릭 제발 때네 군인 난주 집부터 마트바리다 야나 육 무니 안에 젠 가로 슈치 중도 버때치네 안에 군인 난주 집부터 마트바리스 슈되지 당아랑 산주 잡치나 만진 남비 유원하래로 센삼백이 가르송 거여랬으나 안에 미 강사님 미 시부들 때비나 간사 코란이 수순 통수 먼저 통고를 했어. 집어 통 말에 간연스나 코란이 힘이 바자 세도 집어san지면 이 코란이는 간사 코란이 통돼야지 안에 유수수 이진 코란 바자 세도를 되는 통벌에 마도 안에 이 코란 미니샤데 갈라월다 통화집에 통 말에서 군이 로컬로가 통들에서 대다 대시에 저번답지 멘도스 산데 나랑
in your presentation, you said that during the program, you showed different images to the participants, and some of them are negative, and some of them are neutral. And I think you said that when you look into the results from the participants, and so since you get two different results from two different types of images, what could be the cause? Is it because of the nature of the objects themselves, or is it because of the mental dispositions of the subjects themselves? Because there's one Buddhist school called mind-only school, and according to them, the mental dispositions or the subjective point of view, or the point of view is more important than the objective things that you see in the outside world while determining this kind of effects. So what you would say about this? And he said that even for one object, different people or different subjects will have different observations of different understandings and different response to that kind of object.
Yeah, exactly. So this is something we really have to consider in our research. Individual differences in initial reactivity to the objects. Even within our sample of participants, you find that some of our participants react very strongly to the spiders and the other pictures, and other participants don't react at all. And especially if you consider someone who's afraid of spiders, right? They're going to really react to the pictures of the spiders, but someone who has a pet spider at home maybe won't react as much. So it really does depend on the individual characteristics of the observer. And in science experiments, a lot of times we're looking at averages across a large number of people. And so we want to know, what is the typical response of all the people in the room? Do most of the people respond negatively to these objects? And if so, do most of the people respond more negatively to the negative objects as compared with the neutral objects? And that is what we find across our whole sample, that most of the people responded more negatively to the negative objects.
So just a brief follow-up, and I think this point was made pretty clearly, but just to amplify. What we did in this study was, in one condition, we tried to facilitate the ability to have this quality of mind where you create distance, and the other condition, the hand condition, we tried to undermine the ability to have this quality of mind. And for most healthy people in the sample, there was a larger discrepancy when they could put something in the shoebox than they could put it in the hand. And one thing that Catherine did not present today, but it's in our data, is that for people who are suffering, people who have depression, the difference between the shoebox and the hand was much smaller. So even when we even when we allowed them to walk down the hill and have an easier way of making this distance, the depressed individuals did not receive this benefit. So when the instructions facilitate creating distance, most people had some benefit, but the ones who had the signs of difficulty did not enjoy the fruits of that instruction.
Question is very simple. When you talk about emotional regulation, what do you mean by emotional regulation?
Good question. We define emotion regulation as really anything that you do to reduce or change, really not reduce, but just change the intensity of your emotional experience. So really anything your mind does to change your emotional experience is considered emotion regulation. Does anyone want to add to that? Okay.